Hey, welcome to Q&A where you ask your questions and I do my best to answer. Got a really good question, a very topical question in light of everything that's been coming out of America recently around that leaked document from the Supreme Court bench concerning the potential overthrowing of Roe versus Wade. Like me, you would have heard many people on both sides of the debate, very strong opinions, very heated discussions going on. And the question is, in the midst of that, is simply this: how should Christians respond to the whole Roe versus Wade debate, as surely we have moved on over the last 50 years? And as I say, I think it's a very good question to ask, very topical in the midst of this, because I think there's more to the response than perhaps we might first think, because I want to suggest that in order to adequately respond to this whole debate, we need to recognize that there are actually two sides, two issues, if you will. One is theological and one is pastoral, and you have to engage with them both. In fact, I think it's best to see them as opposite sides of the same coin. Sadly, I think we tend to polarize over one or the other, as perhaps, and if this is your question, please forgive me. I'm not trying to come down on you or anything like that, but the question says, surely we've moved on over the last 50 years. The implication being that surely that we've moved on as a society to determine what a good society, a decent society looks like, and why is this even an issue? People matter more. What's going on in their life, how they feel, should take precedence over anything else. And that's why I'm saying we need to look at the theological and pastoral together. Otherwise, I think we're never going to make progress, and I think we're not really going to have anything meaningful to contribute to the conversation. So here's how I think we should respond. First, theologically, I want to say that first and foremost, humanity has never been defined by society. It's always been defined by God. What it means to be human is not the prerogative of society to determine. They don't determine when a life begins, whether it be in utero, after it's born. They don't at the 38th week or whenever. We don't get to decide that. Genesis 1:26 says that we're made in the image of God. It's the Creator that determines our humanity. And therefore, we need to start from a theological perspective. And the reason I say that is that Roe versus Wade or any other piece of legislation to do with morality should never bend us out of shape just because a society has decided something. That doesn't make it so. Theologically, we would say that it's the prerogative of the Creator to determine these things. And so we approach it from a theological perspective first. As Christians, the long-standing position has been that life begins in utero. We don't have time to go into it all, but there's a number of different verses. But let me just give you a couple that shed some light on how the Bible has always understood this, and because as Christians it shapes our perspective. It shapes the way that the church has responded for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, and in fact through the Old Testament into the New Testament, right through. So I think of, for example, Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 5, where God is calling Jeremiah, and he says to Jeremiah, I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. And right there, there's this thought that there implicit in it is that life is not just a random coming together of cells. It's not just a biological thing. That God is at work knitting together, creating life in the womb as a consequence of two people coming together. We see that in Psalm 139 verses 13 and 14, a passage which If you've been around the church a while, you would have heard quoted, even if you don't remember the reference. It goes, "You made all the delicate innermost parts of my being, knitted me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so fearfully and wonderfully. Your workmanship is marvelous," or "your workmanship is wonderful." And in that verse, there's this recognition that we didn't come about simply because of a night of passion by our parents or anything like that. That we are an expression of God's creativity. We are an expression of who God is. Because we're made in his image, he wants to create life as an expression of him. And so when a couple come together, he uses that as an opportunity to create life and to give expression to something of who he is in the world that he's created. So we've always had this view as Christians that life begins in utero. And science has long held that same position. I know that science differs about the dates and the stages of gestation and all those sorts of things. But fundamentally, science has always held the view that life begins in utero. I remember seeing 5-10 years ago an article out of Princeton University which made the statement that the starting point for human life it comes into existence with the formulation of the single-celled zygote. The zygote is the new cell that's created when an egg has been fertilized. And so here's this scientific position saying that life begins with the creation of that cell. We know from science, for example, that at week 3 from the time of conception, that the fetus develops a heart. And at week 6, you can begin to hear that heartbeat. We know that at week 4, for example, that the head has been created, the eyes, the ears, and the nose have all been formed. And bear in mind, this is often around the time that a woman discovers that she's pregnant, that she's carrying life. And yet, even though that's her first, perhaps, recognition, all of this has been taking place behind the scenes, independent of her. You see, it's not just an extension of her body. This is a life developing that is dependent on her. Week 8, the basic organs have all been created. And so theologically, the starting point is that life is created by God. God determines what it means to be human. He determines the value, the sanctity of life as a consequence. And because it's in utero, and science would say that these things are being formed, this fetus is being formed as an entity, as a being. It's got a heart. It's got all these things happening. Then we need theologically to take the whole canon of Scripture into mind. And for example, in Exodus 20, verse 13, God said, "Do not murder." So if we recognize that this thing growing in a woman is actually a life, a baby, it's a life being created by God, to abort it is to murder. And theologically, think about the implications of that in terms of how that separates somebody from sin. And so I simply say that because we have to respond first by recognizing the theological foundation for the sanctity of life in utero. And when we do it, then enables us to engage and respond pastorally. I know we talk a lot currently about the rights. I've heard people say the overturning of Roe versus Wade would be a direct attack on women's freedom and right to choose. I don't want to get into that, except to say that there's always been, from a Christian perspective, the freedom to make choices, but there are boundaries around where around those choices and around those freedoms. So, for example, women say, and people say it's a woman's right to choose, my body, my choice, all those sorts of things. I think of Isaiah 45, verse 9, where it says, does the clay pot argue with its maker? Does the clay dispute with the potter who's shaping it, saying, "Stop, you're doing it wrong"? we get to make choices about our body, but there are limitations around that choice. There are boundaries around that choice. So I want to say that theologically, if we recognize that life begins in utero, the question then is, how do we respond to people who have had or are contemplating an abortion? I want to suggest that the starting point is the recognition for the majority of abortions. Despite the rhetoric that we hear, numerous, so many studies have been done in America and around the world as to why women choose abortion. And the greatest percentage by far, and I'm sorry I don't have the stats, I'll try and find them and post them in the comments below. But the overwhelming majority of women say that the reason they want an abortion is that the pregnancy would interfere with their life plans. Another one that ranked up there was they weren't sure whether they could afford a child. Another significant reason was, hey, this was unplanned. This is a result of the failure of birth control. I don't want it. I was taking birth control. I'll just take another step. In other words, all of the reasons that women are having abortions are never, and they're all about themselves, about their personal well-being, about their life plans. It has nothing to do with accepting responsibility for the consequences of choices that made. It's not thinking about the life they're carrying. It's thinking about themselves only. And so, however we respond, pastorally, I think that we need to respond against that backdrop, that people are wrestling with something that's happened to them, and it's thrown them a curveball, or it's turned their world upside down. And that's an opportunity for you and I to step in as Christians and respond with grace and truth, but to respond as Christ. And however you want to do that, here's my advice. If we're going to respond pastorally, it must always be as Christ responds. And if you read the scriptures, Jesus stepped into people's lives where they were at. He spoke truth in a way that helped them begin to look and at a bigger picture and begin to journey from despair to hope. And our response must follow that. But here's the critical thing. When Jesus went to the cross and paid the price for our sin, he didn't say, right, I've saved your life. Now you're on your own. He said, no, I will be with you until the end of the age. And then he sent the Holy Spirit to comfort, to strengthen, and to help us through that. And I say that simply because our response can never be to say, hey, what you're doing is wrong, and to convince people not to have an abortion. And I think we need to do that. But we must follow through and say, because of the choice that you've made, we're here for you. Just as Jesus saved us and then said, I will stick with you. I will not abandon you. I will help you. I'll be with you through the ups and downs. We need to be prepared to invest in that person's life as well, through the ups and downs, helping where we can, encouraging, surrounding them. It's the old adage, it takes a village to raise a child. So that's how I think that we should respond to Roe versus Wade. I think we shouldn't separate into a theological versus pastoral. I think that they're both different sides of the same coin. If we understand the theological basis, it gives us the strength to respond pastorally and do the hard yards wherever that may lead us. So that's how I would respond. I think what's happening is going to create some exciting opportunities for many people to rethink their faith. I think it gives us the opportunity to engage with hope in the midst of people's lives and begin to create pathways to journey from where they find themselves into a future and a hope that God has for them. So that's it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Post a comment in the below, or you can drop me a line, hamish@alc.org.nz. Until next time, God bless.